What is up, everybody? It is AxelBeats here for AnimeUproar, and recently we covered one of the most famous antagonist groups in anime history, being the Phantom Troupe. So this week I thought it would be fun to talk about another iconic antagonist group, this time focusing on Fullmetal Alchemist's Homunculi. Each of these characters are representative of one of the 7 deadly sins, and their leader, Father, just might be one of the most interesting villains anime has ever had to offer. And when you put all of that together, it makes a topic I cannot wait to get into. I will also follow up with the 2003 version, which has a few small changes here or there, and a couple very big changes. And of course, another big villain rather than Father behind the scenes. Before we get into things though, if you enjoy this video and maybe you want to see more Fullmetal Alchemist content on the channel, be sure to leave a like, and if you're new here, or if you just haven't subscribed to AnimeUproar yet, make this the video that you subscribe and click that bell to select all notifications. And hey, if this video does particularly well, maybe I can talk Animac and Gozen into letting me make a behemoth of a video talking about all types of alchemy and their respective alchemists. So be sure to show your support down below. You can also show some support by following AnimeUproar on Twitter and Instagram, at AnimeUproar, or you can follow myself, at ExcellianYT. Of course, this video will contain Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and Fullmetal Alchemist spoilers, so please proceed with caution, you have been warned. When it comes to Brotherhood, I think the best place to start is arguably the most recognizable of the 7 named homunculi created by Father, with Lust.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but I promise I only like her because of her very integral role in the story. She is so impactful through the entire thing, it's great. Also, she is extremely hot. Lust, in accordance to her name, wears a tight black dress that has a very low cut. She has long black hair, and of course she has a pretty flirtatious way of talking. Lust in many ways acts as an archetypal Black Widow, luring men in with her looks and then savagely and sadistically attacking them. What is interesting about Lust in particular is that she doesn't exactly follow any of the traits of her namesake. Not traditionally, at least. While every other homunculus acts according to their title, Lust isn't exactly going around trying to sleep with people. Instead, she weaponizes her sexuality and presses that way of thinking into her opponents. That said, while she doesn't show lust in the traditional sense, it could definitely be argued that she does have a sense of bloodlust, seeming to get a real feeling of fulfillment from torturing and killing people. She also definitely had a sense of superiority when it comes to humans in general. To her, they are simple, weak, and naive, however, at the same time, that naivety seemed to be something that she found at least somewhat charming. Though this might be more in line with when a person sees their pet do something stupid, you know? It's really cute, but also still very dumb. All to say, Lust is a very cold and vindictive woman who loves nothing more than to play on the, well, lustfulness of men. And at the same time, when it comes to the other homunculi, her relationships are more akin to how people might see their family. Some of them she doesn't really get along with, some of them she does. But the most notable relationship that she has is definitely with Gluttony, acting as a pseudo-big sister or mother figure for him and keeping him under some kind of control. Now, let's move on to what she can actually do in terms of abilities. As a baseline, all homunculi share the majority of their powers and have 1 or 2 unique traits to them. These shared ones usually include things like being incredibly strong and fast, having never-aging bodies that don't get sick, not needing to eat or drink, and being able to nearly instantly heal any damage that they take. Effectively, they are just near-immortal superhumans, powered by Philosopher's Stones. Now, there is, of course, a limit to the healing that they can do, as Lust herself finds out when she comes face-to-face with Mustang, but in general, this is kind of the rule-of-thumb list for all homunculi. There are some exceptions to the list, and if they are really big standouts, I'll mention them as we go, but this is just a good baseline. So that said, Lust's unique ability is Ultimate Spear, allowing her to grow her fingers into long, piercing spikes that, to the best of my knowledge, don't have any real limit on their distance, and they can go through just about anything. This allows Lust to turn her fingers into bullets that launch themselves into who or whatever she points them at. While these tend to be used more as piercing tools, she can also use them as blades to slice with as well. It's a very simple and straightforward ability, but it is extremely effective all the same, which does tend to be the trend for most homunculus abilities. Now, also something shared with every named homunculi in Brotherhood is that each of them is killed in a way which somewhat correlates to their sin. For example, Lust was killed by Roy Mustang, someone who is famously a womanizer.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Next up, let's go with Gluttony. As per the name, he's kinda just a tubby bald guy. Something I've really liked about him though is his face. He has these small, white, beady eyes and a massive mouth. It looks kinda goofy, but when you combine it with his very childlike personality, it makes him very likable, which makes his horror moments all that more effective through contrast. Speaking of, as you might expect for a monster named Gluttony, his whole thing is eating people, particularly liking to eat women. But at the end of the day, he probably won't complain about getting any food of any kind. Gluttony was always such an interesting character to me, as despite the dark side that he had, he was also probably one of the most pure and at times human characters as well, at least among the homunculi. He shows actual sadness when he learns about Lust dying, he is overjoyed when Greed is reborn, and there are a ton of little nuggets of emotion from Gluttony throughout the entire series, which really shine through because of his childishness. And speaking of his childishness, that is the exact reason why he is typically paired with Lust, who kind of guides him by the hand and keeps him in check. But all that said, it isn't like Gluttony is a drastically complex character at the end of the day. He's just a childlike man obsessed with eating people. And that's kinda it. As far as his unique ability goes though, firstly, he has a very strong sense of smell which he can use to hunt people down, but more importantly and much more iconically, his stomach is basically a pocket dimension. This is because when Father made Gluttony, he was trying to make a new gate of truth. However, he failed, and Gluttony's gate instead leads to a domain between the actual gate and the normal world. Gluttony can pull people into his gate with a beam that comes from his stomach, and once they're inside, the only way for them to get out is to perform human transmutation. Now, normally this would lead them to the gate of truth, where they would meet truth, and lose an arm, a leg, or whatever else. However, when used within Gluttony's dimension, the gate instead leads back to the normal world, circumventing the entire process, so as far as we can tell, we don't lose anything this way. And finally, Gluttony's ironic end comes when he is devoured by Pride.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Next up, let's cover Envy. This is a character I didn't really like when I first watched the show, but upon rewatching it last year, I found him to be a lot more sympathetic of a character. Still, kind of a dickling, but better the second time around for sure. Out of all the homunculi, Envy hates humans the most, seeming to take the most pride out of torturing them and making them suffer. The only one who this is even comparable with is maybe Pride, which, to be fair, they're both kind of horrific monsters. We see Envy taking pride in the fact that he played a role in the incident which started the Ishvalan War, as well as just in general for ruining the lives of countless people. All of this, though, stems from what his name suggests: envy, specifically for humanity's ability to endure, as well as for their knack to form close bonds which cause them to love and support one another. As a homunculus, he never really experienced that, and as such he aims to destroy it when he sees it in others. I know I typically talk about appearance first, but with Envy, we kinda have to talk about his ability because it's tied to his appearance. Envy is a shapeshifter, being able to turn into anything or anyone as long as it doesn't exceed the mass of his true form. And this true form is kinda massive, so it's usually not an issue. He can also change individual parts of his body into things like snakes, or even giant portions of his true form at will, so it doesn't have to be a 100% transformation kind of thing. Along with this, he can also imitate people's personalities and voices, but it isn't a perfect impersonation. His overconfidence tends to shine through, and those who know the person he's trying to imitate very intimately can usually see through the disguise. Now, on to Envy's true form. This comes in two parts. Firstly, in a massive green lizard monster with a dog's face, long black hair, multiple eyes, and a back that is covered in the faces of humans who represent those who died in Xerxes. It is absolute nightmare fuel, and of the entire series, it's probably one of the images that stayed in my head the longest after first watching it. However, after most of his Philosopher's Stone is destroyed, he becomes a small green parasite that can attach to people or to mannequin homunculi, and can even control them if he bites into them. Of course, he eventually dies in this smaller form, choosing to take his own life when Edward explains that the homunculus is in fact jealous of humanity's friendship, a reality that Envy has been avoiding his entire life, and when faced with it directly is something which led to him removing his own Philosopher's Stone.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Our fourth homunculus is Greed. Greed is a surprisingly wise homunculus who is, as you might assume, very, very greedy. His worldview is one that suggests everyone in the world is greedy. While he himself wants money, women, status, fame, and everything else the world has to offer, including eternal life, he also argues that everyone wants something, and even the desire to do good is a form of greed. Greed is beyond charismatic and charming, and yes, super narcissistic. But in most cases, if he's not trying to take something, he's pretty easygoing and comfortable. Something which might stem from his unique ability, the Ultimate Shield. Greed is able to harden the carbon all over his body to make a dense black material that coats his entire body that is as durable as diamond. He can also cover specific points of his body or inside his body as well, and it makes him essentially impervious to damage, with one of the only real weaknesses being transmuting that carbon to something less durable, like when Ed changed it to graphite. Now combine this Ultimate Shield with the general homunculus trait of regeneration and immortality, and you get someone who is extremely difficult to kill. Speaking of difficult to kill, he was killed-ish by Father when his greed and goals were revealed. Father elected to have him drowned in molten gold, which, I mean, gold and greed is a pretty easy parallel to make. However, this was not the end of Greed's story, as after Lust is killed, Father revives Greed as a Philosopher's Stone and decides to place it inside Ling. Greed's memories were wiped and he was reborn, and as a result, he is entirely loyal to Father once taking over Ling's body. However, eventually his memories flood back into him and he once again defects. Along the way, Ling's mind is awakened as well within the new Greed, and he kind of acts as a pseudo-conscience. Not exactly a moral conscience, but at least a voice of reason from time to time. Over their new cohabitance, Greed even begins opening up to Ling, him even explaining that what he really desired most in the world was to have people in his life that were close to him, something that is very easy to parallel with Envy. This new Greed was such an interesting character, and his growth is really put on display in the final fight, where not only does he stop Ling from sacrificing himself and being pulled into Father, but he also decides to heal Ling before he himself dies. An act of generosity to the only true friend he has ever made.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Moving on to Brotherhood Sloth, and we can all agree this is the worst one, right, between both series? He is this hulking, burly man who just drudges forward until his mission is complete, all so he can finally sleep once it's done. This is kind of a difficult homunculus to talk about because even more so than Gluttony, Sloth is a very flat and one-dimensional character. His role in the story was to dig the transmutation circle under Amestris, and he just doesn't really do much outside of that. On top of that, he doesn't really have a special ability per se. He uses chains in fights, which are kind of interesting, and his physical strength and durability is pretty up there, even being able to take a point-blank shot from a tank fairly easily. However, the closest thing we could really call to Sloth's special ability is his tendency to dash at people at incredible speeds that are often uncontrollable. On top of not being able to be easily controlled, you have to couple in that Sloth is incredibly naive and very clumsy, often leading to him making mistakes, which can definitely be an issue when you take into account that he heals slower than any of his siblings, obviously with the exception of Wrath, who doesn't heal. Sloth's ironic end comes in the form of him overworking his Philosopher's Stone when he takes too much damage. Once the stone is depleted, he shortly passes away, and he finally gets the rest he desired.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Next up is a character who is likely the creepiest in the series, being Salim Bradley, Pride. This was the first homunculus ever created by Father, and it's just kind of pure malice incarnate. What made it 1,000 times creepier than it already was is that it takes the form of a little kid. As the name suggests, Pride is very self-important, seeing humans as toys or slaves and trying to convince his siblings to do the same. This superiority and arrogance carries on into his fights as well, as he typically taunts his opponents to see if he can get them to make mistakes. Furthermore, because he thinks he's so far above his opponents, he will often underestimate them. Finally, you probably don't want to be on Pride's team when it comes to battle, as if he has the opportunity, he will eat you to gain an advantage, just like he did with Gluttony. Now, you might be asking what exactly Pride does when it comes to battle. Well, that comes in the form of him controlling a massive shadow with tons of eyes and mouths. He can shape it into long tendrils that can slice through anything, very much in a more versatile version of Lust's ultimate spear. However, this does not come without its own set of weaknesses. As his abilities come from shadows, he needs to be in a place where shadows are present. So, anywhere that is completely dark, or anywhere that has too bright of lights where shadows aren't being cast, he can't really do much with his abilities. Honestly, a pretty good trade-off to make, because anyone who is in the range of his abilities can be freely manipulated, absorbed, or just straight up attacked whenever he wants. Speaking of absorption though, if Pride does choose to eat someone, he will gain their abilities, their knowledge, and their weaknesses. For example, when he eats Gluttony, he gets his sense of smell and hunger. When he absorbs Kimberly, he learns some form of alchemy. And when he eats the Gold-Toothed Doctor, he learns his knowledge of human transmutation. Basically, on top of being a shadow monster, he's also Kirby. Pride was defeated in Brotherhood when he tries to take over Edward, a human who he deemed to be lower than himself. As he tries this, Kimberly intervenes, giving Ed the chance to counterattack and defeat the homunculus. This brings out his true form, which looks like a small fetus that is even weaker than the humans he looked down on.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
And that brings us to our final sin-named homunculus in Brotherhood, being Wrath, Führer King Bradley. Unlike his siblings, Bradley is a human-based homunculus, giving him his own set of unique traits. He was an orphan raised with the name of Prospective Führer 12 in a secret program created by Father and the Amestris military, all in hopes to produce the perfect ruler. In this program, students would learn politics, military strategy, swordplay, and whatever else might be required of a true king. Each was also taught that everyone around them was only there to become stepping stones for their own greatness. If they killed a classmate, that only meant that the other student wasn't worthy to be king. At the end of this very brutal training, a Philosopher's Stone was injected into the candidates, and only number 12 survived, making him the first human-based homunculus, and having him be granted the name King Bradley. Based on his talents attained from the program, Bradley quickly rose through the military and became Führer, getting married and adopting a son named Selim, later revealed to be Pride. Bradley acted and led Amestris in a way which facilitated Father's wishes, be it fighting a war to create a new Philosopher's Stone, or keeping other military personnel blind to what was truly happening. Bradley, let's be real, is one of the most badass characters in the series, and a lot of this comes from his ability to be a phenomenal actor. He can go from playful and charming to overwhelmingly confident and threatening at the drop of a hat, making him one of the strongest presences in the entire story. And of course, fitting to a character in his position, Bradley is overflowing with charisma that is even attractive to those watching. I cannot think of a single person who does not love this character. But let's talk about what he can actually do. As I said, he is a human-based homunculus, which makes him a little bit special. At its core, this meant that he was the only homunculus that can age. In most cases, this would be a negative, but if you're holding public office and you live in the public eye, it might become a bit weird if you just stayed 20 years old forever. Eventually, people would catch on that something was up. Furthermore, while Bradley is stronger, faster, and more agile than most of the characters in the series, this is all just him, and it doesn't come from his Philosopher's Stone at all. He also doesn't get the regeneration or immortality attributed from being a homunculus, but what he does get is his special ability, the Ultimate Eye. With this, he can essentially see shortly into the future and perfectly see his surroundings. This, combined with his godlike reflexes, make him incredibly difficult to hit, let alone to beat in combat. A good example of this is when we see him fight Greedling, Fu, and Buccaneer more or less all at once, and almost not taking any hits until a surprise attack knocks him off balance. That said, his aging body can't always keep up with what his eye predicts in every situation, but despite this, he can still move and react fast enough to deflect machine gun rounds with his sword, cut a tank shell in half, and just more or less dominate everything in front of him. His eye also allows him to analyze his opponents, seeing their strengths, weaknesses, and what movement they might make just by looking at them. Wrath is eventually defeated by the reformed Scar, and dies with a peaceful smile on his face.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
And that brings us to the final Brotherhood homunculus for this video, the Dwarf in the Flask, Father. Created from Hohenheim's blood through experiments in Xerxes, the Dwarf in the Flask was produced with a wealth of understanding of the universe, particularly in the field of alchemy. Living with the young Hohenheim, then named Slave 23, the homunculus would go on to teach him enough to earn his freedom, things like literacy and, of course, alchemy. Over time, the dwarf grew jealous of humanity, their freedom, their cohabitation, and their support system, all while he was locked away and lonely in his flask. All of the sins that he removed from himself were still very much in play while he was in this form. He began to lose self-esteem as he was alone and replaced it with hubris. Those humans that he was envious of knew nothing. They were beneath him, and as someone who understood alchemy, he was effectively a god. No, he was greater than God. The king of Xerxes eventually called for the dwarf in the flask and asked him to help gain immortality. The homunculus agreed to help, ordering the construction of a nationwide transmutation circle along with the slaughter of countless citizens. However, he lied to the king. Rather than granting immortality to the monarch, the dwarf in the flask instead granted it to both himself and Hohenheim, turning them both into living philosopher's stones and turning the king into just another sacrifice. Horrified at what happened, Hohenheim decides to abandon the homunculus, and as the years passed, the homunculus would go on to pull the flaws from himself and produce children, the embodiments of his lust, gluttony, envy, greed, sloth, pride, and wrath. And through this, he gained his new name, Father. His ultimate goal in the story was to attain the power of God, something that he could do by repeating what he had once done in Xerxes, but this time with a mistress. This was eventually successful as he devoured God and became essentially almighty. However, Hohenheim had a solution. Using the moon's shadow as a massive transmutation circle, he released all of the Mestrian souls within Father, and with them no longer fueling him, he was not fully able to control the power of God. His body started straining. This fight continues for some time, but the longer it goes on, the more and more Father begins to struggle to contain God, and as he struggles to keep this power within himself, he is ultimately defeated by a massive group effort of nearly every relevant living character in the story at this point. Ed lands one final blow, and all of the remaining souls, as well as the god within him, are released, leaving his body to crumble. His soul then appears in front of Truth in his original form as the dwarf from the flask. Truth berates him for his actions and mentality. He had removed so much of himself and swallowed God hoping to become perfect, rather than embracing who he was. Truth ultimately takes away the freedom that Father had sacrificed Xerxes to acquire by sealing him beyond the gate, ending the homunculus's story. As far as abilities go, I mean, all of them, right? Father had perfect control over alchemy, and he is a living philosopher's stone. He is immortal, ungodly strong, fast, smart. The dude could just about do everything that he wanted to, and that was kind of before swallowing God. So it's a little bit difficult to describe everything that he's able to do as just there's too much. Just know he is basically all-powerful and able to do whatever he wants in his prime. But that wraps up the Brotherhood homunculus, so next let's take a look at their 2003 counterparts. Hot take, by the way, I think the homunculi in 2003 are infinitely more interesting. I think that their method of creation is so much more poetically powerful, and it adds a lot to the story which just is lost in Brotherhood. Canon or not, that's just my opinion. Obviously, there are some elements from Brotherhood that I think far outweigh the 2003 version, but when it comes to the homunculus as a group, I think 2003 has a little bit of an edge. So, homunculus in the 2003 version are not created by Father because Father does not exist. Rather, they are produced when a human transmutation is attempted. The transmutation, as always, will fail, and rather than a person being brought back to life, a new being is created instead. A monster with their genetics and some of their memories, but still entirely its own. If this monster is fed red stones, they will become more powerful and eventually a full-fledged homunculus. What I really like about this is that it makes the consequences for their actions go beyond just themselves. Ed doesn't just lose an arm and a leg, he creates an actual monster in the world. The taboo of human transmutation in alchemy is a form of social contract. There's a responsibility and promise that comes with being an alchemist that you will not breach this. And as such, it makes sense for there to be real-world social consequences when that contract is breached. All of the homunculus in the 2003 version also share a weakness in that if the bones of their original body are brought nearby, they are weakened, and if it's close enough, they are entirely paralyzed. Now I'm only going to explain the major changes and the homunculus origins because otherwise it would get very repetitive, so just keep that in mind going forward.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Starting with Lust, she was created when Scar's brother attempted to bring back his dead lover, and as such he was made in his lover's image, which can I just say, nice. Lust's personality is largely similar between the versions, however, what she lusts for in this version is to become human. To meet this end, she will lead alchemists to seek out the Philosopher's Stone, hoping that she can take it and give it to Dante, who would use it to make her human. However, she eventually learns that Dante is lying to her and defects, ultimately leading Dante to send Wrath to kill her. As she dies, she wonders where Homunculus will go once they pass on. While Lust is still pretty savage at times in this version, the much more human element I think goes a long way into making her a very sympathetic character.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Gluttony in the 2003 version is almost the same as Brotherhood. Until he learns of Lust's death, of course. This time, Dante lobotomizes him, ultimately leading him to become a pure sense of gluttony, devouring everything and everyone in his path, including, eventually, Dante. In 2003, he is also not a false gate of truth, rather, he was created by Dante to drink the red water and to consume human flesh, until they condensed in his stomach and made a new Philosopher's Stone. However, the core themes of his character being one that is created by Father or Dante to meet their ultimate goal is still something that is very much held intact.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Envy in the 2003 version was the first homunculus created and was created when Hohenheim tried to revive he and Dante's dead son. Envy hated Hohenheim for abandoning both he and his mother, and as you might imagine, he was a bit envious of the Elric brothers who received some of Hohenheim's affection and fatherly love. Unlike the other homunculi, he has no real desire to become human. Instead, he just wants to kill as many people as he can.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
2003 Greed was created by Dante, and much like his Brotherhood counterpart, he eventually rebelled against his creator. He wanted a truly immortal body, trying to get Edward to bind his soul to armor just like Al's had been. Of course, there is no Greed Ling in this version, as Ling is not a character, but it is also important to note that Greed is another character who doesn't really care about becoming human. So, those are the ones that more or less translate somewhat directly from Brotherhood to this version. The rest are completely reimagined characters for the most part.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Wrath in this version was created when Izumi Curtis tried to revive her stillborn son. When the resurrected corpse was not her child, she decided to give it back to the gate. But as the gate closed in front of her, she began to hear the baby cry and regretted not keeping it. As Wrath grew older, he eventually opened the gate himself, but emerged with no memories. He had found himself on Yawk Island, and eventually was taken in by the Curtis family for a short time, until the military captured him and Envy took the opportunity to feed him red stones, unlocking his true personality. From here, Wrath decides to join the homunculi, where he latched onto Sloth as a new adopted mother. Wrath in 2003 had a powerful bloodlust after eating the red stones, very different to whom he was prior. For much of the story, Wrath also had Edward's missing arm and leg, which resulted in him being a homunculi who could perform alchemy, making him a very powerful opponent.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Sloth is probably one of my favorite characters in the 2003 version, and maybe even in Fullmetal Alchemist in general, which is ironic because of how much I dislike the other version of Sloth. She was created by Edward when he tried to revive his mother, and as such, she looks just like her. Sloth in this case does not refer to slow movement or laziness like it does in Brotherhood, it instead refers to her apathetic personality. As for her unique ability, she can turn parts of herself into flowing water that she can kind of control at will. She plays a very interesting role in the story as she shares some of Trisha Elric's memories and is very much disturbed by them. But at the same time, she uses the memory of Trisha within Ed, Al, and Hohenheim to make openings that she can take advantage of.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Finally, we have 2003's Pride, which of course is Fuhrer King Bradley, rather than him being Wrath like he was in Brotherhood. He plays very much a similar role, raising through the military to become Führer and manipulating a mistress to produce a Philosopher's Stone. There are a few big differences between the King Bradleys though. Namely, this version is still able to regenerate when injured, making him even more dangerous. He even allows Mustang to blow him up and regenerates from next to nothing. Furthermore, this time he is much more savage than he was in Brotherhood, which says a lot because that Bradley was also kind of a monster. The only reason they were able to defeat him in this version is because as his house burns down, Salim brings him a treasure from his locked safe. He did this in hopes of protecting what he thought was his father's most prized possession. However, the treasure was the skull of the man he had been born from. In a fit of rage, Bradley strangles his son to death, and afterwards, due to being weakened by his closeness to the skull, Mustang is able to take him down just as he had with Lust in Brotherhood.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
And the last character we have to cover is Dante, the big bad from the original Fullmetal Alchemist. Dante transfers her soul from person to person using a Philosopher's Stone to prolong her life. 4 centuries ago, she started doing the nasty with Hohenheim, and they were able to live together for centuries because of this ability. They even had a son who unfortunately died at 18. As mentioned previously, Hohenheim tries to revive this boy, and he would eventually become Envy. Together, Dante and Hohenheim would go on to destroy 2 major cities as they prolonged their own life, turning the inhabitants of these cities into Philosopher's Stones and jumping into new bodies. Eventually, Hohenheim would leave Dante though and fell in love with Trisha Elric. Now alone, Dante began creating homunculi, feeding the husks that remained from human transmutation red stones and convincing them to work for her. If they did so, she promised to make them human once she got the Philosopher's Stone. This was of course a lie, and instead she only wanted to extend her own life. The only homunculi who knew the truth were Pride and Envy. Pride went along with it because he received a position of power, while Envy just wanted to murder people. Ultimately, Dante's immortality was far from perfect. When she jumped to her new host, she always left behind a part of her soul, becoming more and more hollow each time she did this. As a result, with her final jump in the series, her soul is having difficulty sustaining a human body. This doesn't entirely matter all that much in the grand scheme of things though, as either way she is devoured by gluttony. And that's it. A look at both versions of Fullmetal Alchemist's homunculi and their leaders. There are definitely good parts of both, the viciousness of Brotherhood's homunculi and the humanity in the 2003 versions. Personally, I think I like the 2003 versions more as a whole, but I totally understand liking the other version more. To me, Lust, Wrath, and Sloth in 2003 are just so much more interesting, whereas Bradley and Greed are much more interesting in Brotherhood. Also, I think Father is probably a little bit more interesting than Dante, although Dante not so bad herself. And that kind of only leaves Envy and Gluttony. Envy is a total toss-up, both versions are very good for different reasons, and Gluttony is just kind of gluttony, so, you know, doesn't super matter. But I would love to hear your own opinions in the comments down below. Which version of homunculi do you like best, and which homunculus is your favorite? Finally, if you guys enjoyed this Fullmetal Alchemist video and you want to see more, please leave a like, and if you're new to AnimeUproar, remember to subscribe and ring that bell. By selecting all notifications, you can guarantee that you will not miss any future videos. And of course, you can also follow AnimeUproar on Twitter and Instagram at AnimeUproar, or you can follow myself at AxelYT. I want to give a big thank you to all of our AnimeUproar patrons who make videos like this one possible. Special thanks to Alpha Sigma, who is an absolute mad lad and disciple of Lord Twigo himself. And of course, the 1-tier patrons, the ones who rise above all other clans. These being Ingrata, Patehefa, Aljatal, Hinokami and Water, The Toasted Chi, The Spike 8227, Dylan Isidore, Spidey Life Tanel, Tungsten Tarkus, Baked Buddhist, and Monkey D. Quilly. And finally, thank you to all of our Pro Hero tier patrons, the one and only Gilgamesh, the Red-Haired Raven, Angel Cruz, Rathuin De Ora, Very Gucci, Alicia Octor, Bonnie Parks, Joanne Garcia, Ted Not Ted, Fatboy Games, Corey McGowan, and Soul Ray Slice and Dice. If you enjoy our videos and feel like they provide some kind of value to you, please consider checking out our Patreon through the link in the description. Anyone who supports the channel with even a single dollar has access to our exclusive Patreon-only Discord, and your name will appear at the end of videos just like all of these phenomenal people. But for now, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, remember to stay Axel.